Hello and welcome to our first Rise Up series. Anti-racism, social justice, and queer movements is the name and topic for today. Just want to make a microphone check. If there's anyone out there that cannot hear me, please raise a hand now, and I'll keep an eye out for that. Okay, great. Looks like we have everyone. Again, my name is, good afternoon. My name is Commander Royce James, and I'm here with my co-host, Lieutenant Commander Kimberly Young McClear. And welcome to our first ride. And we are very excited to bring our program to you this afternoon on Juneteenth and the intersectionality between that and Stonewall. I wanted to go over a couple of things from the beginning. This is our first of the Rise Up, like I mentioned, but there will be other programs that we have with other topical areas to address. So don't get too comfortable. We're going to continue going. We're going to keep everybody muted for the first part of the program. There's some questions that we have for our guests that we will have answered, and you can add to the chat, but we will keep you muted until the very end, when we can then put in more questions in the question and answer session that'll be more interactive. For those of you that are watching on live stream, we will go back and take a look at your comments, but please do send us emails. Hopefully you have the email addresses for us or your local LDAC that can also get information to us. I also wanted to just again, thank you all for making here. We have some boundaries that we're going to maintain, and you saw most of them. You saw most of them when you checked in, but please do remember to keep that in mind. This is a safe space, and we will, at any time we feel like someone's safety is in any way, shape, form challenged or in jeopardy, remove you from the room. So please maintain that and contact through the chat. You can reach out to our moderators that are going to have some support with making that happen. With no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kim Young McClear, who's going to give a brief introduction to our guests. Oh, sorry, having a little bit of technical difficulties. We're gonna go ahead and make sure that our moderators can actually be heard.
Hi, good afternoon. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me. We are so just privileged and honored to have two very dynamic and engaging guests with us, Reverend Dr. Rebecca Savage and also Director Jalen Scott. I definitely don't want to go on and on about their bios and resumes, but I do want to just say first thank you to our guests. And you know, I've learned so much just even in our planning calls to even have this Juneteenth event. So I just want to acknowledge that and just say thank you. So Reverend Dr. Rebecca Savage uses she, her, hers pronouns, and so does Director Jalen Scott. And what's really, I think for me personally, that's really powerful about the two of them, and I'm kind of talking about them together because I know they're also going to talk a little bit about their long history of advocacy and social justice for our community, but just how they complement one another. And so I'm going to kind of kick it back to Commander James just to offer a little bit more detail on their bio, because he actually knows them a little bit more than me. So I'm going to chime back in just a moment, but I'm going to kick it back to Commander James to add more.
Oh, great. Make sure I'm off mute. I always have to do this in my class too. With our new remote class, I have to make sure I'm actually off mute. So thank you, Lieutenant Commander Young McClear. So I just gonna go ahead and get things rolling. That very close friends of mine. I feel like Reverend Dr. Rebecca Savage is a current UU minister serving her congregation in Maryland. So if you make yourselves out to Maryland at a UU church, you may see her in the pulpit. She's also one of the sitting members of the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. That's a longstanding part of the ministerial process of bringing in new ministers. So those of us that are in the military know very well how that process works. Dr. Savage was also a former military chaplain, and she served our country honorably and is now in the IRR. So she has firsthand knowledge of what it's like to be in the military. And so Director Jalen Scott is the director of a nonprofit out in Seattle that focuses on bringing about legal services to specifically LGBT folks who can work without having to pull in a lawyer. So there's lots of processes that can be that we can do and things that we can, with support, handle. And we all know with oppression, that is invaluable resource for our community. So she's the current director of that. And I'm sorry, Jalen, could you tell me the name of the actual full name of the actual organization again? Oh, right. Could we unmute her, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I am executive director at Lavender Rights Project, and we do actually have attorneys, which is great, and we also do larger programming in the Seattle area. I am also the founding member of the Washington Black Trans Task Force that's also here in Seattle, specifically focused on those services that Commander James was just speaking about, and not actually having an attorney represented in that aspect. So.
Thank you so much for filling those blank spots in for me. So the next thing that we're going to do is move right along. We actually have a very, very full program that I want to make sure we're able to get to all pieces. Specifically, we're going to start with opening the space with an opening ritual that kind of brings us all in. I know it's late in the day. We've had many things happening throughout our days. We want to focus on what we're here for. And what we're really here for is absolutely to uplift and to find intersectionality between us in fighting and eradicating anti-Blackness, fighting and eradicating oppression of our LGBTQIA+ siblings. So one way we can start that conversation and start the intense work, literally, that could happen here in front of us, is with an opening ritual. So I'll ask Reverend Rebecca to first start, and then we'll have Director Jalen Scott to also follow up with the second half of the ritual.
Thank you all. Thank you, Royce. Thank you. It is such an honor to be here with you. So this opening ritual is to acknowledge the grief that's in the room. Can everyone hear me okay? I can see some of the screens. If you could just give me a north-south, thank you so much. To name the grief that's in this room. Not only are we acknowledging, it's Juneteenth, Pride is coming up, but we're acknowledging the uprising that's going on around this country, around this world. This is a time of really recognizing the trauma that many of our communities have disproportionately been impacted by for not just one generation, but many generations. And so we are naming this collective grief that we're coming to this space in order to recognize and to heal. and to recognize I would not have commissioned as an Army chaplain in 2003 and served over 10 years honorably unless there were generations of Black women, queer women before me who were able to serve as well. So it was only their legacy that I was able to come in, and many of us can point to those in our history as well. But with that acknowledgement, we bring to the space, our families are hurting, our communities are hurting. So I invite you now, if you have a family member or a loved one who's been impacted by COVID-19, if you have a name on your heart, I welcome you to put that name in the chat and we'll bring them here into the space. Similarly, if you'd like to name an ancestor, someone who made your service possible, someone who brought you hope, someone that made it, well, open the doors for you to serve. I invite you to put them their names in the chat as well. And it will be my honor to read those names. We have Lee James, James Kawamoto, Walter Scott, Terry Garnett, Paulina Rains Darlett, Vertilla Looney, Dennis Parker, Bomar Voldort, Percolia Davis, Larry Mayo, Martha Cielo Tarado, Ishtar Green, Joe Willie Turner, Mimi Morales Maldonado, thank you. If those are names of people who are no longer with us, may their memory and their legacy be a blessing. May their energy guide this space. One more, Willie James Moore, Michael Carter. And if they are still living, let us send them our energy and our prayers and the gratitude for their influence on your life. And if they're hurting right now, or maybe perhaps they're sick. I mean, everyone's struggling right now. We send them our love and prayers. I invite you to continue to put the names in the chat whenever you feel so moved. It's important to remember that we are all in this together. We're only going to get free together by knowing each other. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's a good transition into just a moment of reflection with all of the names that you've shared here. We want to honor, but also given that this is both Juneteenth today and Pride, thinking about our transgender siblings who have been murdered this year, brutally murdered often. I know that for some of us in this space that might be difficult, and I want you to feel free to step out, but the ask is that we reflect on any of the names here, any that were unnamed, but I'll lead with the names of our trans siblings who were killed. It's about twice a month now that we're learning, and we're on track in 2020 to be even beyond the twice a month rate of our siblings being murdered, our community members. So I'm going to ask just a brief centering. If you'd like to, you can join me. The way that I reflect is I take in a name, I take in a person's story, I take in the pain of who they were and who they were not allowed to be. And then I just breathe out both good wishes for those and love and care and concern for those who have passed and those who are present, protection. And I let that just go ride my breath. In breath, I just take it in. All of these beautiful names. And then I breathe out. Dustin Parker, Neolisa Luciano Ruiz, Yampi Arocha, Monica Diamond, Lexi, Joanna Metzger, Serena Angelique Vilquez Romez, Selena Reyes Hernandez, Leila Sanchez, Penelope Ramirez, Nina Pop, Halo Reagan, Tony McDade, Remy Fales, Jane Thompson, Rhea Milton. Thank you.
Thank you both for that time of reflection. It's hard to say we're not living in interesting times. I think that, you know, I tell this to my kids sometimes, that they always feel like that their experience is the only experience. And I definitely feel as though, you know, history will tell these tales, right? And where we are. But I think it's a bit undisputed that we're living in some very specifically interesting and in some ways, hopefully pivotal times. I think that's why many of us are here on Juneteenth for maybe their first Juneteenth and maybe their first hearing of Stonewall, and maybe your first hearing about intersectionality. It's a very important topic. I would say that it's a topic that transcends all aspects of how we live our lives, because it's how all aspects of our lives actually has been made the way that it is today. So in the spirit of that, Lieutenant Commander Young McClear and I have taken off our uniforms and don our traditional garb to the best that we know it, and have met with our wonderful guest panelists to specifically talk about Juneteenth, anti-Blackness, intersectionality, and Stonewall. So now Reverend Rebecca and Director Jalen are going to give us a couple minutes introduction on those two topics, and then we have 4 questions that we're going to pose.
I guess that's me. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. So where to start? You know, this holiday, June 19th, today's June 19th, and it's called Juneteenth because in 1865, I apologize if you've heard this every single year for years and years, but some haven't. Union soldiers announced to the enslaved persons in Texas that the Civil War had ended and they are freed from bondage by the Emancipation Proclamation. Everyone's sort of familiar with that? Yes, okay. Emancipation Proclamation was 2 years prior, though, of course, didn't make its way to Texas until that date. So we honor Juneteenth, this day, the celebration of the end of chattel slavery in the United States, by envisioning a world freer, a world more equal, more just than the one that we currently live in. And every year since 1865, that's 155 years, we have been honoring and witnessing on Juneteenth, mostly by reading the Emancipation Proclamation, depending on the community. You know, we've gathered together to honor this fight for freedom. But this year, 155 years later, Juneteenth comes during a national uprising, a global witness against anti-Black racism. Broad coalitions, movements all over the world are standing up for the abolition of our unjust systems, our inequalities, our policing systems, our health inequalities, our income inequalities, our institutions and ideologies that are disproportionately harming Black and Brown and Indigenous people and people of color in our worlds. So this movement, this uprising is centering Black voices, demanding justice, accountability, and freedom. And this is a time of our country being broken open by the trauma of watching the unlawful murder of unarmed Black men, Black women, trans people. We are reminded that Juneteenth comes to mark the liberation that is truly not ours, liberation that is truly not realized. We are today reminded that when we look around our world, there is still wealth inequality, education disparities, access to healthcare, safe drinking water. Hello, Flint, Michigan. Living areas for Black and Brown communities are disproportionately in places that are unsafe. If you look up redlining, when we take a hard look at the school to prison pipeline, and if you don't know what that is, look it up. I was just saying to the other presenters, as we were discussing earlier, that Van Jones recently said, in the information age, the excuse of ignorance, there's no excuse for ignorance, no excuse. You can find any book, any documentary, any movie, any resource to find out how other people are living. You can even watch them on cameras. You can see communities and how they're living. So go learn, learn, and learn, and learn. If you haven't heard about income inequality, look up the Poor People's Campaign. There's a mass gathering tomorrow, digital gathering online. Ignorance is a choice, Van Jones talks about. And what anti-Blackness was transformed as we're celebrating Juneteenth, June 19th, 155 years ago, moved into Jim Crow, moved into redlining, moved into the school to prison pipeline. So where are those seeds now? Those seeds are in every single major institution of this country, of many of the ways in which we operate, the values that we put forth, how we run our school systems, even our standards of beauty and aesthetics. There's anti-Blackness woven through all of it. I could go on forever and ever. I'm a chaplain and a minister. My job is but I'll stop there. I will share some words by Adrienne Maree Brown, who recently, she's a queer Black writer, and she wrote Emergent Strategy. And this is a blog that she shared today. And at the end, she writes, today we continue the work of burning down slavery. Today we cannot be distracted from the target. Today we cannot be kept from the joy. Today we cannot be made small. Today we only can be free. Hold on to your collaborators, dance in the face of provocateurs, ignore those who try to draw your attention from the collective target of defunding and evolving. Keep love at the center and enjoy your precious Black day life all day long. If you wonder, worry, or doubt about how you're doing this day, listen for Harriet. Harriet whispering to you, my people are free. Not will be, but are. Act accordingly.
Thank you, Doc. I am inspired with those words, and I'm very grateful that you opened with them. I want to extend this conversation about delayed liberation, really, and even Juneteenth, finding out about liberation much later than it arrived. Now, us not having full liberation, and it's 2020. Not too long ago were we enslaved, but so long it's been since the Civil Rights Movement, and so long since 400 years ago when we first yelled for our freedom. Thinking about pride and the LGBTQ plus community, specifically if we're talking about intersectionality, the Black, Indigenous, POC movement, pride hasn't actually necessarily been for us. And it is this same delayed liberation. We have received marriage equality, we have received workplace rights, especially with the new Supreme Court decision. Other states already had them before. But that meant not much for a Black trans community that could not take care of their basic needs. You're not worried about marriage if you are worried about livelihood and food and the ability to just live and thrive. So Pride is complicated for us, and the story of Stonewall is complicated. Its own story, as well as the Compton cafeteria, and all the West Coast organizing stories. The stories that are lifted are white LGBTQ plus liberation narratives. And we were there the whole time. Black trans women lit the spark of liberation in Pride, including with Marsha P. Johnson, Mother Major, Griffin Gracie, Latinx, Sylvia Rivera, another of our mothers. They were there and they kept the fire going, even until now. But delayed liberation, even in the community of LGBTQ plus folk. They were yelled at, they were pushed aside, they were used occasionally when it was convenient, but now we're still the marginalized community most likely to be murdered.
Thank you to both Doc Reverend and Director for those opening very powerful statements. Juneteenth is definitely, it's a spiritual day, it's a historical day. It's a time to reflect, to be introspective. And some of the things that I was kind of thinking about, even just preparing for this event, was just really these kind of nodes in time that seem to kind of repeat and compound on itself. Whether we're talking about Ghana, whether we're talking about Galveston, the home to obviously where Juneteenth originated from, or we're talking about Greenwood, or Tulsa, right? Or if we're talking about Greenwich in New York City, Stonewall. A lot of folks don't even recognize or appreciate New York City was considered the Jim Crow capital of the North. And there's lots of, history to even unpack just the depth and dimension of just all the intersections of the different social justice movements and this delayed liberation, right? And it brings us into present time with George Floyd, and we see the global protests. So it's really kind of this full circle of hundreds of years of pain and trauma. And at the same time, we also celebrate and we rejoice and we affirm. So I just wanted to just again, just kind of add to the space. And so transitioning into the questions that we have about 4 questions that we're going to ask for our panelists, and then we're going to allot a few minutes at the end for Q&A, and then we have a closing aspect to the formal program. So the first question that should show up on the screen there, it says, how do we help others in 2020 understand the unimaginable violence against Black lives taken from West Africa, right? For 300 years, when many of us are now becoming outraged about 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Thanks for the question. I think that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, there is some frustration with me in that it took June of 2020 for people to be outraged. And now everyone is on board. And I think in humility, I had to think about that. We live really busy lives, and work and family consume us. At this time of COVID, there's been a little bit of relaxation so that we can pay attention to other areas. And I am starting to get a new respect for this moment. That 8 minutes and 46 seconds it's a metaphor. It's a reflection of 400 plus years. It is an eternity. If you've watched it, you probably have felt the profound timelessness in the pain and suffering in that video. And it reminds us, right? It reminds us what was taken away from us, what we've never received. I'm thinking of specifically, because it's Pride, because of intersectionality, in indigenous and often West African cultures, there are norms that are more accepting of non-binary and transgender individuals, though those labels are more ours and not theirs. And as with our food, and as with our music, and as with the security of having an estate and a lineage that was taken away from us, and Eurocentric norms were projected onto us. And so this connection with the murder of Black trans women to the larger oppression story of Black people is very clear to me, very clear. Rebecca, what do you think?
I think we could talk all day long, my goodness. And the first thing that also came to me is one of the things that broke my heart going to the marches. I live outside Washington, D.C., is going to the protests down by the White House, downtown, to witness this moment. One of the signs that I saw that took my breath away was, all mothers were called when George called for his.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing those words, I mean, how do you get people to understand? It starts with empathy. It starts with grief. It starts with, I need you to see, I am a mother and I'm also a child of a mother. God forbid that my child or that my mother would have to watch me calling for them, or my children calling for them, in a moment of just absolute sheer inhumanity. I mean, that's what I feel like people need to know is feel. It's not a thinking thing. I don't need you to rationalize, yeah, but he was this and that. No, that's not what this moment is about. That was a person crying for his mother with bystanders pleading for them to stop. Just let us check on him. That basic inhumanity is at the root of anti-Blackness, is at the root of transphobia, is at the root of all of the ills that create systemic breaks and cracks in our society. Okay, yeah, that's what I would say.
I just think it's interesting that we often need these touchstones to let movements move forward, and the current uprising, this being a touchstone, right? And Stonewall for Pride. But, you know, it does miss the entire history and lineage of resistance, of pain and suffering, when we focus just on those pieces. But for some reason, the universe delivers these moments for us to just wake up. So this 8-minute 46 is just a wake up and a touch into that empathy and that feeling that you were talking about.
I do have to say that resonates really a lot with me when I think about this, and I think back to the early 90s with, you know, Spike Lee, you know, standing at the sign, you know, at the foot of the statue, right, and, you know, yelling literally "Wake up" with Lawrence Fishburne, right, and so like those moments of non-reality and some you know, in some motion picture to a literal video of an actual person being murdered by those who are supposed to protect and serve, just really to me outlines this complete breakdown in reality of what each of those mean, right? Is, you know, what is that structure here for, and what are the people here for, right? And so are the people here to be in some subservient, oppressed for the use of, or are those systems that are supposed to protect really to reinforce what's already there? So I really am picking up and pulling in from what you both are saying, and it's really resonating with me.
Thanks. Is that better? Can you hear me now better?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
No problem. And something that I really wanted to just briefly go over is, you know, how to help people understand. If you're seeking to understand, and this is more to the allies and the ones who maybe are looking, how do we change? How do we change if we are disproportionately not marginalized, or if we are coming from a place of privilege? Please don't go to your Black friends, your trans friends, and ask them to teach you. right? So I'm talking to folks of privilege who are in places of authority. This is not the time to ask people who are experiencing a new level of trauma. Our communities are hurting, our families are hurting, and this is a moment to do some deep soul searching and build coalitions with other allies and advocates.
Thank you, Reverend Rebecca. And it brings us to actually our next question. Next June marks the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, where hundreds of Black people, families, women, children were murdered. Where do you see parallels between Tulsa, Juneteenth, and today?
Mm-hmm. I am by far not a historian, but one of the parallels of both of those is how the story has been told, how the history has been captured and basically erased. I mean, how many people on this, not everyone's videos on, but I wouldn't be surprised if 50% of the folks on this line, or maybe folks in your circles, have never heard of the Tulsa riots and the Tulsa massacres. And it's only recently that I feel that more of these stories are being told. So the parallel between Juneteenth is delayed freedom, right? And delayed storytelling. The story that was told, everything was erased. If you go back and try and find the newspaper articles of that time, there aren't any. There aren't any because the story wasn't told. It was as if it never existed. These families, these communities, these women, these children, these businesses never existed the first time. And the parallels for me speak to, and this is more from a leadership perspective, of if you don't have the right people in the room, this might be a stretch, so stay with me. But a lot of you are leaders, and this is to speak to this moment moving forward. If you don't have the right people in the room telling their story, the story gets left out. The power shifts to those who are only empowered to be able to tell the story. I'm not explaining that very well, but I think you see my point is we are forgotten if we're not in being represented in authority and being in those leadership positions. So that's one of the parallels that I saw between the two.
I'm interested in, here in Seattle, there is a large movement. It has in some ways been co-opted, but leadership in the Black community has been consistent and present at, if not the main, Chaz or CHOP or those community spaces that are popping up in other spaces, both online and in our neighborhoods. It's interesting to me that today, Juneteenth, is one of the biggest celebrations I've seen in Seattle happening today. And it's around a march with around the death of our trans Black siblings and our cisgender, meaning non-trans, Black men who are being killed. And it's interesting how Black folk can hold celebration and suffering, this paradox together, that somehow paying attention to this, I think oftentimes people don't want to look because it feels like it's just too hard. But learn from us, paying attention to this actually builds community. And thinking about Juneteenth, this extreme suffering and mark of the end of it has turned into, a place where you can do the electric slide again with your family and have a barbecue and see your cousins and play spades and talk the dozens. It's through this celebration that we've learned to acknowledge this painful history. So I see some parallels with this moment now, and hoping that today people just enjoy themselves and really immerse themselves in the culture of who we are, in remembrance of George Floyd, of Remy, and of Rhea.
A colleague of mine once lamented we need a theology of Black joy. of Black queer joy, of Black trans joy, of Black joy, because we have this ability of being incredibly hopeful despite everything that's happened. And that ability to create spaces that are joyful as we remember and mourn together is remarkable. So, thank you. Thank you for that.
I agree. And we have to be careful about, I think others thinking, oh, that means that we're happy about what happened or it doesn't matter. Like, no, we're not. That joy comes with rage too.
Joy comes with rage, absolutely. To give meaning for what's left.
That's right. That's right.
So I know just from, I'm just kind of taking everything in. That was definitely, it spoke to my heart, how you both framed it. So for our logistics, a little admin announcement in the chat section. This is for our Zoom participants. There's many of us on the call. If your heart is calling and you'd like to pose some questions, this would be the time to do it in the chat section. And one of our co-moderators, one of our CG Spectrum founders, co-founders, Derek, is monitoring the chat. So if you're on Zoom and your heart's calling you to ask a question, we will have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So now is the best time to start kind of thinking about those questions. So going back to our panelists, so given that the queer community is intersectional and racially diverse, what are your perspectives about the historical whitewashing of the Stonewall riots? I know that each of you have kind of talked about whitewashing a little bit, but maybe if you can unpack that further and you were to takeaways for us today.
Yeah. I grew up in Mississippi, and I think Mississippi has changed a lot, and many of you are from the South. And if you're LGBTQ, Black and from the South, you understand that the culture around queerness is completely different. I didn't, especially at the time, resonate at all with Pride, didn't know the Stonewall story, or if I'd heard it, it felt not relevant. We didn't come out in the way that I think non-Black LGBTQ plus community came out. We came out in community with new families, with house mothers, with Vogue houses, with creativity and music, with artist community. Like, those are the ways that we came out, because that's what was safe for us. And where there was a Pride story where our non-Black siblings were able to get on television or march in the street, or all of those things, we have always existed in this, I would say, small sub-community of resistance, right? That could not safely express themselves in the exact same way. So for me, Stonewall had no meaning until I learned about Mother Marsha P. Johnson and Mother Sylvia Rivera and Mother Major. And realized that it was, and usually is, right? It sometimes is Black folk in the background starting revolution and change. And so this whole time, Marsha P. had been the mother of Pride, had been the mother of liberation. She was there from the beginning, and she helped organize and keep the fire going. I didn't know that, and that's a story that I should have known growing up, because that would have given me pride in my own self, in my own transition, in my own life. So this historical whitewashing makes gayness and queerness and all of those things just about non-Black community, when Black community have the same statistics of transness and queerness as other communities. And it erases our stories, and it doesn't help our youth who are growing up and need to hear these stories, need to hear that they started this, that they own it, that it is from their blood, it is from their lineage of Black queerness that we have gotten so far in this country in regards to queer and trans liberation.
Amen. Thank you for that. And I learned a lot from watching Pose. Has everyone seen Pose? Yes? If you want to know about late 80s, early 90s queer culture, trans culture in New York City, watch the series Pose. It's amazing. My experience, so I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and came out queer pretty early on. So our great act of defiance every year was going down to D.C. to Lambda Rising and the bookstores in DuPont Circle. Any other DCites who might remember that time? Maybe a little bit, yeah.
Indeed, absolutely.
Indeed. And I would say that, I mean, similar to the standards of beauty in this country that are disproportionately white, straight, male, beautiful. When I was growing up, you know, the image, the representation, you talked about respectability politics in the Black community. It's very true in the queer community as well. You know, the respectability politics means like, who is the presentable ones? Who sort of passes? Who is fitting the heteronormative, patriarchal way of being, so they do look like they can be accepted, you know. And that is part of why the Pride story in Stonewall was never about our mothers, was never about the mothers who threw their heels and started that movement and that moment. And yeah, that's, I could go on and on about that, but whitewashing, I was astonished. I went to a queer justice meeting, I think it was last year, and I was appalled to see that every single person in leadership was a white gay man. Every single person. 7 people in leadership, and every single one. I was like, I can't be a part of this. This is irresponsible. You have not done the work. So, love you, mean it. I'm out.
Yeah, I think that I am probably, and I don't want to erase anyone, but I think I am the only Black, queer, or trans leader of a LGBTQ organization in Seattle. And Seattle, as progressive as it is, the first, I believe, Black trans ED of an LGBTQ organization. And I could, if I could be wrong because I may not know the full history, but as far as I know, and we're just not there. I'm looking at Kristen's comment about a functional, dysfunctional system or functioning as design. And I'm thinking about how Pride became corporate and by design started reflecting an image of male beauty that was also white, that was built, that was not effeminate, that did not include trans people, which furthered this erasure of us from the riots. So whether or not it began by design, you know, I can't say, but it certainly, as it became capitalist, was designed to make money for people who often were not in our community.
Thank you both for that. It was riveting. I think I love how you're both weaving in history. I know you're saying you're not historians, but with relevancy. And I think that it's far to the common theme I'm hearing is this erasure and how it's become cyclical, that where we have this reminder of the oppression, we also have that's the ebb, I guess, and the flow of the erasure that happens after. And so we have one more question that we're actually going to put up for reflection. We're not going to necessarily, because we're running low on time. And so we're going to leave this one. I think that this is a great question, specifically because it bookends the first question in examining the global reaction to George Floyd's lynching. Many are speaking up now, right, including our top military leadership. What does this mean for justice, and where do we start? And so pack that in. Keep that on the tip of the thread. I will invite everyone to say thank you to our sponsors, specifically the Coast Guard Spectrum Affinity Group. Feel free to go on our website, and we'll put a link up here in a bit, and chat about this question. There's definitely places that we can do more to understand where we are in this process. But I think we're going to choose a couple of the questions that are in the chat I think Jalen already started with one of them, but I'm going to go ahead and just read it out straight. And it was actually from Alex Wade. And then I think Kristen also gave some more information on the bottom. And Alex says, I often hear folks saying that George Floyd video was the initial piece of evidence. Sorry, that we will need to see how broken our systems are. When I hear this, I usually push back and point out that it's actually evidence of the systems working as they were designed to originally. That is to keep Black, Indigenous, POC, people of color marginalized and oppressed while propping up white folk. What thought do we have on this area? Are things broken and need fixing, or are they working as they were designed and need abolishing, dismantling, and replacing?
Does it have to be so binary? I mean, it's a both and, right? Because the system is designed to protect, but the way that the lens of protection is actually played out is not just. So it's a both and. I mean, we're in this moment where we're dismantling and building and learning and growing and reflecting and tossing things out all at the same time. So yes to all the above, but as long as we're moving in the right direction. Because yeah. Jalen, what do you think?
I mean, it's something that, not to bring in necessarily a controversial subject, but it's something in this call to reform or defund or dismantle, depending on where you are in life, the police. Thinking about the history of policing, I think it's just really important for all of us to contemplate the connection to slave patrols. And then look at the timeline for how long did it take before we imprisoned a significant amount of the Black population that were freed at Emancipation Proclamation or the Civil Rights Movement. Like looking at the direct connection to initial policing, to a reform of a system that was intended to oppress us so that we can repeat that oppression in different ways, and the usage of incarcerated labor and the connection to slavery. I think it's good for us to contemplate that entire timeline. And I don't necessarily think that there is a great designer of the system besides white supremacy, besides neo-European ideas. I don't think this is really don't think it's an individual thing, but it's how unchecked power, unchecked bias, and privilege in the system will play itself out until we root it out.
Okay, thank you both for that response. We're running a little low on time, so we're gonna get one more question, and I'm gonna just start reading it. This is from Asma Looney, and I'm curious what our speakers' thoughts are about microaggressions and how they play a part in racial trauma. For those that don't know, microaggressions are everyday insults, indignities, and demeaning messages sent to people of color by well-intentioned white people who are unaware of the hidden messages being sent to them. These aggressions are broken into micro-assaults, micro-insults, I'm kind of jumping around, and micro-invalidations. Please check the chat for those definitions. And then, for instance, white people often ask Asian Americans where they were born, conveying the message that they are perpetual foreigners in their land. So again, to ask the question again, or the comment, the speaker's thoughts about microaggressions and how they play a part in racial trauma in 4 minutes or less.
What comes to mind with that is death by 1,000 paper cuts. You know, it's not just once, but it's a cut on top of a cut on top of a cut on top of a cut. It's not seeing yourself represented in spaces. It's not seeing yourself or your family represented in leadership. It's not, you know, I'm thinking back to when I was on active duty, one of my responsibilities was to review a newsletter for the chaplains. And someone gave me their copy And all the pictures were happy white couples with kids, with happy white kids, happy white straight couples with kids. And I said, really? You have 9 pictures in here, and not a one picture represents the diversity of this organization, and even your staff. I was a major, so I can talk like that. Um, and, and I think, so micro assault and micro trauma, like that those small cuts over and over and over and over again are what continued. And that was tiny. That was just a little tiny thing. To even more like physical trauma, like physical intimidation. On top of, we're looking at generational trauma, and I apologize, and I'll keep it short, but there's generational PTSD, that they were finding that survivors of the Holocaust were passing on to their children, their grandchildren, the same trauma that was being held into their bodies. And that same studies have been done in poor communities, in Black communities, in Indigenous communities. Can you only imagine the level of trauma that children being separated from their parents at the border are experiencing? That generational trauma is passed down to us, and on top of this, microaggressions and microassaults, it hurts our souls, and it really impacts the way that we are alive.
I agree. Thank you for those words. Nothing to add there.
Yes, and thank you also for both of the questions that came through. I know that there are certainly more questions that people are asking than we have the time to answer. So I wanted to kind of just transition a little bit and talk about, what's next and where do we go from here. So many of you all have reached out to us as an affinity group asking for resources and just literally where to begin. And just on the topic of, the 1,000 paper cuts, there's a lot of us in the service, in uniform, in civilian uniform, that, we have those cuts, we have those scars, and many of us are on this call now listening and our hearts open, our minds are open, and we're seeking change. We're seeking to be seen as human, to be heard, and so I just wanted to just really kind of just wrap my arms around those statements about the paper cuts, because oftentimes someone can dismiss it as trivial, but they do add up, and it is that trauma upon trauma upon trauma. So with the overflow of questions that we're getting, and feel free to keep submitting those. And you can also contact us at our website, which is coastguardspectrum.com. And we also have our Facebook page, which is public, and we also have a private group as well. So there's a couple of different ways to reach us. And again, this is really the launch of our series. So this is one of many conversations that we're going to have. And we're not just going to be talking, with words. We're also going to be demonstrating those words through actions as well. So the next slide just shows our website. So it should pop up there in a second. So if you go to coastguardspectrum.com, there we have a resource library. We have anti-racism work. We have some scaffolding work. And it's really work to the point that was mentioned before about, you kind of have to do the work. Don't just go to the first person of color or first Black person and have them educate you, right? So we update our website often. And if there's any resources that have been helpful for you all that should be added, feel free to let us know as well. So just want to transition into the closing. We have a closing ritual. So the screen is going to go dark, and then we're going to start our closing ritual, and then we'll close out the program.
Great. I feel like we have 60 seconds, so I'll keep it short. I want us to, in this space, just acknowledge how hard parts of this conversation was, and know that whatever it is you're going through, and specifically if you are a person of color and LGBTQ+, or if you're LGBTQ+ and not a person of color, or if you're an ally, or if you're just entering into allyship, we need you. We need you.
We need your heart, we need your compassion, we need your leadership, we need your courage. There's a lot of people on this call that we know are hurting, and they need you too. So we ask that the one prayer from departing in this time together in 10 seconds or less. I'm just going to ask you to put your hand on your heart and extend your other hand out if you're so willing. This is an affirmation of this time together, because these conversations will transform our world. Absolutely. I believe it in my heart. I feel your heart. I see your heart. And so towards the good, as we say, forward together, not one step back. So bless you. May you be encouraged by this time. May you go forth with some spark of intensity of how to make our world better. And may you know you are loved. You are held in a love greater than we could possibly transfer in my little hand upon this screen. Thank you and blessings.
Thank you both, Reverend Rebecca and Director Jalen, for becoming a part of our family. And to all of you that are watching us on the live stream, thank you also for joining us. I know it's hard to not contribute in the direct way. We will look at your comments, and those of you that have been commenting in the chat, we welcome you back to Spaces. We will reconvene and do this again. Again, thanks to Coast Guard Spectrum for sponsoring the event today. And with no further ado, blessings to you and be well until next we meet. Please check our website for our future events for the rest of the month.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.